Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of many things, but I want to try a slightly different thing on this channel. And I thought I would do a series in which I'm going to talk about what makes this a great story. I want to bring together both my academic interests and my impulses and instincts as a creative writer to talk about these plays, and maybe we'll talk about more than Shakespeare as we go, we'll see. Strictly in terms of story, right? What is it that makes these things work? So I'm responding as both a scholar and a storyteller. And whether I do more of them will kind of depend on whether people find them interesting or entertaining. This is, of course, going to be, I'm trying to keep this short, so it's going to be highly selective. If I was teaching this play, I would probably spend 2 weeks easy on it. That's 6 hours. And I have actually spent an entire semester just on Macbeth. So this is going to be a very, very short, highly selective, highly personal, non-definitive account. So if there's anything here of value, great. Enjoy. I chose Macbeth to start this series because it's getting a lot of attention right now because of the new movie with Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand, which I think is definitely worth checking out, as is the version with Patrick Stewart and Kate Fleetwood. It looks very different from a few years ago. And there are other versions as well. So this is an easy play to see performed, which I think is, how you should always approach Shakespeare. I should also say that it's one of the many plays which shows up in my new novel, Burning Shakespeare, which is a light comic, fantasy time travel-y kind of thing about somebody who's trying to wipe Shakespeare out of history. I'll put all the purchase links and stuff in the description below. So what makes this story great? And let me emphasize story. A lot of the time we talk about Shakespeare, we talk about the poetry and the politics. And, maybe we'll get into some of that as we go. But I also don't want to strip it down simply to the plot, right? Shakespeare is a great writer in many ways. He's not an originator of story, of plot per se. Most of which, he tends to get from other sources. In the case of Macbeth, he's getting them from historical accounts. And he takes these things and then turns them into story. And whenever a writer is approaching a story, one of the questions always is, where does this story begin? What is it that propels us forward and into it? And with Macbeth, we get 2 moments. First, we get this very strange appearance by the weird sisters, which are usually referred to as the witches. Weird is a word associated with fate, with being able to foresee the future somehow, which obviously is their function. But there's a strangeness to them right from the start that I think throws the whole story into mystery and something both sinister and paranormal, right? Much of the play could be told as strictly realist military and political conflict. But this extra dimension, I think, to it frames the whole in terms of people who are trying to, in some ways, control their lives regardless of forces outside their control. And whether you believe in things like that or not, it's a great metaphor for the way that we constantly are battling against the things that we are that are beyond our capacity to shape, whether that's fate or some sort of spiritual presence of some or whatever it is, or whether it's just the economic situation into which we are born, or the nature of where we live and who we know, and all these are the things that shape us. This is a story about people trying to change their stars, to put it in another term, right? To shape their destinies, and the way that this somehow unravels because they can't get everything under control. So again, whether you think of it as metaphysics or as just a sort of metaphor for life, it's compelling. But as story, it also has that extra creepy, supernatural kind of dimension. So next we go to Duncan, who's the king. But we immediately sort of see him in this. However, you can idealize Duncan. You think he's a good person, but he's not a great king, right? Politically, militarily, he is at best sort of sidelined. He's sort of, if not actually corrupt, then at least sort of irrelevant. There's a rebellion in Scotland. MacDonald has partnered with foreign forces, with Irish mercenaries, and with the King of Norway to basically wrest control of Scotland from Duncan. And Duncan is nowhere involved in the fighting. He's off on the side with his sons, who are also not involved, right? And the bulk of the work is being done by Macbeth and Banquo. They win, of course. Macbeth faces the traitor MacDonald and splits him open and cuts his head off. And it's a powerful image. The text says he unseamed him from the nave to the chops and set his head upon our battlements. And it's a powerful image. I think it's one that sort of haunts the play, because it's one of the things that says, this is the kind of world that we're in. It's a world of expressly male violence. The way you solve problems is by killing people in violent ways. And I think, one of the reasons that particular image is so powerful is because at the end of the play, as we come sort of full circle, and Macduff is going to defeat Macbeth, and Macbeth at that point thinks he's invulnerable, right? He thinks none of woman born can harm him. It's one of the things he learns from the witches. And then it turns out that Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, which means he was effectively born by a C-section. And in this period, of course, that meant that his mother was dead, right? They couldn't keep a mother alive because of the blood loss while delivering a baby that way. And it's the same image, right? The C-section is that same image of MacDonald being unseamed from the nave to the chops, as if Macbeth's cycle of violence has somehow created the very thing that has to destroy him, right? The other respect in which Duncan is sort of incompetent is that, according to the period, Scotland was an elected monarchy, and there are traces of this within the play that's not always clear. And what happened when a king had to be selected, the thanes, the lords, would come together and basically vote, right? They would choose one of their own to be the next king. Now, what's really clear from these early scenes is that everybody is looking to Macbeth to be the future and possibly even the king. So there's a real awkwardness, and it's one that often gets sort of represented on stage when Duncan decides to name his son Malcolm Prince of Cumberland, which means he's next in line for the throne. Because that's a breaking of the rule, right? That in making that determination, he's basically saying, I'm creating a dynasty. I'm creating this, the crown will pass through my family line, kind of like it does in the English monarchy, but which was not typical for Scotland, right? The moment he does that, it changes the story. Because when the witches come to Macbeth and say, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor, hail to thee that shalt be king hereafter, it is perfectly possible for Macbeth to become king. In many ways, he's the front runner, right? Because he's the one holding the country together. and because at some point Duncan will die and the Thanes will choose the next king, and Macbeth is well positioned. The moment Duncan says next king's going to be Malcolm, that takes Macbeth's ambition and changes it. It now forces his hand, which is why he says, when he hears Malcolm announced as Prince of Cumberland, he's like, that's a step which I'm going to have to somehow get past. And so what could have been a sort of generalized sense of, well, maybe one day I will be king, has now become something that perhaps is appropriate to me, is destined for me, which Duncan is now blocking. And now the conversation between Macbeth and his wife changes, and it immediately becomes a question of murder, of assassination, of regicide, right? And this, of course, is the circumstance in which we first meet Lady Macbeth, one of the sort of great female figures in Shakespeare. And sometimes people say, somewhat jokingly, that the Macbeths are the happiest couple in Shakespeare. Which sounds odd when you think about it, but think about the other plays, not a lot of happy couples. A lot of couples coming together, particularly in the comedies, but not so much couples who are already couples. Now, some of this is about the fact that on the Renaissance stage, of course, all the women were played by boys or men, if they were comic roles. So the company only has, 15 actors at any given time. Only 2 or 3 of them are going to be able to play female roles because they're using boys who have to be trained in a certain way. So this is one of the reasons that there are not a lot of female roles on the Renaissance stage. But it also means that married women are few and far between, right? If it's a romantic comedy and a woman might be a sort of a romantic ideal, a target, somebody that the story is going to focus on in that sense, then yes, she's going to be around. But in representations of married couples, not so much. So the Macbeths are at least unusual in this. And they do seem to be interestingly equal. And if you doubt this, look at the ways that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth talk to each other in ways quite different from, say, the way the Capulets talk to each other in Romeo and Juliet, where Lord Capulet, is absolutely in charge, whereas Macbeth refers to his wife as my dearest partner in greatness. It's an extraordinary line, right? This is not to say, of course, that they have somehow transcended traditional gender roles. Quite the contrary, and this becomes a real issue, right? That Lady Macbeth feels that in order to do what she wants for herself, maybe for her husband, maybe for themselves together, that she has to somehow cast off her femininity, to stop being female, because to be female is to be in some ways easily swayed within the rhetoric of the period, right? It's to have less pity, less compassion, less love. It's to be harder. Now, we can talk about this as a convention of the Renaissance, the early modern period in which the play has been written, but it's also very specific to this play, which, as I've already said, is defined almost entirely by male violence. How do you get things done? A guy kills somebody. That's their MO all the time. So women are either on the sidelines waiting to become victims like Lady Macduff, or they have to somehow involve themselves by becoming sort of kind of masculine. Though, of course, Lady Macbeth doesn't exactly do that. She asks to be unsexed, not resexed, right? She's trying to sort of stop up her femininity, a very physical image, right, above the sort of penetrable female body. And she asks that the milk in her breasts is taken and replaced by something bitter, gall, right? So that she can involve herself in this plan to give her husband what she thinks he wants, or what they want together. People often characterize Lady Macbeth as the villain of the piece, but that's not actually the case. Macbeth has already had the idea. Lady Macbeth is trying to help him to fulfill what he says he wants. And people often speculate as to why this is. As I said, there's a political reason in that Malcolm becomes a problem in ways that he isn't at the beginning of the play because of the Prince of Cumberland thing. There's also something about, Duncan is trying to create a dynasty, as I said, by passing things on to his children. And this play is obsessed with children. And the Macbeths don't have any. But what's odd is that Lady Macbeth says she has, when she's talking about that quite terrifying image that she uses when Macbeth says, we're not going to do this, I've changed my mind, we're not going to kill Duncan. And she freaks out, and she's like saying, and she says, in breaking your word as a man, that is like me as a woman taking the baby who's nursing at my breast and dashing its brains out. And she specifically says, I have given suck. Right? I have nursed a baby. I know how 'tis to love the babe that milks me. Right? So she has had a child. Where's the child? The Macbeths have no children, and that becomes a sort of sticking point, because after Macbeth does become king, he becomes increasingly obsessed with with Duncan's idea, ironically, of creating a line of kings, something that was promised to Banquo, but not to him, right? So one of the ways that actors will sometimes read this play is by saying that part of what the Macbeths are doing is seeking to fulfill an absence, death of a child, and it's become quite common in modern productions for there to be, an empty crib or something on stage, as if what brings them, they're brought together by death, and this is an absence that they are attempting to fill with power and ambition and the crown, right? This, of course, is not an excuse, it's an explanation, or a possible explanation. So this is part of what is driving the story, right? That we often talk about what characters want, what's pushing them, what's driving them. And I think, one of the things that becomes increasingly clear is that after killing Duncan, and it's an extraordinary sequence, right, where we actually get to see the assassination, though it takes place off stage. We see them getting ready for it. We see Macbeth imagining the dagger in front of him, or hallucinating the dagger. It's not entirely clear whether the dagger's there or not, before he then goes to kill Duncan. And then immediately being haunted by it, right? That sort of freak out that they both have, right? And he brings the daggers out of the chamber, which he wasn't supposed to do. He was supposed to leave them there. And she has to go back. And she's then freaked out by what she sees, the state of the blood. And this is something that then gets into her head. And she's, later in the play, this sort of endless sleepwalking where she's trying to wash her hands, trying to sort of literally and figuratively cleanse herself of the blood of Duncan. And of course, the blood of a lot of other people, right? Because what is clear from the story, and again, there's a profound psychological truth to this, that the thing you think you want is never actually enough. They get the crown and they get away with it, right? But immediately they get away with it, Macbeth becomes a kind of monster that he wasn't before. He was a soldier before, ruthless and efficient, but he had principles and he did what he was supposed to do. Once he's king, he becomes paranoid, he can't sleep, he does not confide in his wife anymore, right? That sense of them being this sort of idealized couple immediately goes away. They are both tarnished in each other's eyes by the very thing that brought them together, and he becomes obsessed with the idea of who poses a threat. So now he goes after Banquo in case Banquo says something, and kills Banquo, but is unable to kill Fleance, right? And Fleance was one of the targets. because of this idea that Banquo would become father to a line of kings. And incidentally, of course, play was written 1605, 1606, thereabouts, under King James, James I of Scotland, James I of England, who had been James VI of Scotland, and who actually traced his lineage from Banquo. So it's all very meta, right? And so Macbeth is now sort of obsessively trying to maintain his position by going after pretty much everybody, right? And it's the perfect image of a kind of despotic, tyrannical king, somebody who has lost all perspective other than somehow maintaining his own position, preserving himself, preserving the future for a child he doesn't even have, you know, because he's not being rational. It's a great image of any kind of modern dictator or warlord who no longer listens to anybody around him, including his wife. And he keeps going back to the witches. So, you know, that sense of the mysterious and the destined never goes away. But destiny is a tricky thing, right? I've talked about this before on this channel. Because we never know what destiny is until it arrives. You can't say, I dodged destiny. I was fated for this to happen, but I managed to get away from it. No. That's not how fate works. If you were fated to die on the street this morning, you'd be dead, because we can only recognize fate after the fact, right? And the other thing, of course, is to say that even if the witches can see the future, that does not mean that they make it happen, right? I can predict that the sun will rise tomorrow. If it comes up, you can thank me. Except that you know that I didn't do it. The fact that I predict it doesn't mean that I'm responsible for it. This is key, right? And it's absolutely central to Shakespeare, and not just to this play, but to most of them. The plays become a whole lot less interesting. And I say this as a storyteller. If we take the responsibility for his actions away from Macbeth, if we blame Lady Macbeth, who is a comparatively minor figure in the play, she only has a few scenes. If we blame her, if we blame the witches, then Macbeth gets off scot-free. And more to the point, the terrible things that happen to him are no longer his fault, right? And that's not Shakespeare. Shakespeare gives us people who I think we're actually supposed to like at the beginning, people we're supposed to admire, at least within their world, and then watch them make terrible decisions, bad call after bad call after bad call, and things get out of hand, and suddenly at the end they are trapped, right? Macbeth talks about himself as like a bear tied to a stake who's being attacked from all sides. And the very universe seems to be conspiring. The trees are walking. They're not, it's just men with camouflage. But, you know, this is one of the things he was told by the witches, who constantly equivocate. They tell him things that he thinks he understands, and then it turns out that he didn't understand them in the right way. No man of woman born can harm you. Okay, then I'm good. Except that's not really what we meant, right? And you're perfectly safe until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, except that for people to cut down the branches and move to cover their numbers is effectively the wood coming to Dunsinane. So, you know, this is classic sort of fable tradition, right? Where there's always a loophole in those sort of those stories where the devil tricks people, or somebody tricks the devil, right? It can go either way. But there are these little loopholes where the story finally makes a kind of sense, yeah? But in each case, this is about the main character, the hero, the protagonist, getting it wrong. And Macbeth is a hero, right? We tend to assume that a hero has to be somebody who's sort of unequivocally great, somebody we immediately admire and like constantly. But that's a very simplified notion of it. For Shakespeare, the hero is really just the person who makes everything happen, you know? And sometimes they're doing good things and sometimes they're doing bad things. And we finish up with a situation, you know, I said at the beginning, the Macbeths are the happiest couple in Shakespeare. And of course, one of the most famous speeches in Shakespeare, and certainly in this play, comes when we discover that his wife has been killed or died, or it's not entirely clear. Maybe she committed suicide after the sleepwalking and so on. And he has that speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And it's an extraordinary speech, right? And people sometimes say, oh, this shows how upset he is about the death of his wife. He's like, no, that's not it at all. That's not it at all. He receives the news of his wife's death and he goes into this speech about his inability to feel anything, about the emptiness of life. You know? That's the problem. He doesn't even have fear. He doesn't have sadness. He's cut away from himself, everything that made him human. And even the person who was closest to him, her death means almost nothing to him. Because at this point, as he says, my life has fallen into the sear, the yellow leaf. He's wilting as he stands in front of you. He's waiting to die, you know? And this is, in some ways, the only just conclusion to the play because of the things that he's done, you know? That particularly, I think, one of the hardest scenes to watch on stage is the murder of Macduff's family, right? And then that news being brought to Macduff in one of the most extraordinary scenes in the play, after this long, convoluted stuff from Malcolm, in which Malcolm is testing Macduff to see which side he's on and whether he's going to be a good king or not. And it's all very problematic. And we come out the other side of that scene and think, Malcolm's the guy we're supposed to be rooting for? I'm not convinced. I don't like him. And Macduff is clearly not swayed also. He's very suspicious of Malcolm, as he should be. But what turns Macduff around is that he's brought the news of the death of his family. And this extremely poignant and painful moment in which Ross and Angus, these guys bring the news, and they have to tell him over and over again because he can't process it. He can't hear it. You know, people talk about Shakespeare being sort of complex and full of big sort of long words and complicated language. But you look at that scene and the way he receives the information. What? All my pretty chickens and their dam at one fell swoop. Did you say all? My wife killed two? We've said. And he keeps asking for the information because he can't get his head around it. And then we get that very telling moment in which Malcolm says, well, you know, okay, basically, get over it and be a man, you know? Let this be the whetstone of your sword, right? Dispute it like a man. And Macduff says, I must first feel it like a man, right? There's not a lot of feeling in masculinity in this play. And Macduff is trying to say, I have to sort of process things. I'm an emotional being, right? Which is something we haven't seen at all. This is, I think, what elevates Macduff in some ways. Because, as I said, you've got a version of sort of agentless women who can't do anything unless they somehow turn themselves into monsters, into a form of masculinity. And we've got the men who run around killing people. And Macduff is somehow manages in this moment to become something a little bit more, I think. It's tricky. But, you know, when Malcolm is saying be like a man, it sounds exactly like Lady Macbeth. Yeah? When she was pushing her husband, be more of a man. You got to be more of a man. And that means kill people. So I think this is central to what the story is about. about people trying to sort of carve out an identity for themselves in a world where their options are very, very limited. And we get to sort of to watch this tragic journey and come to some sort of conclusion, though, who's on the throne at the end? Not Macduff, not Fleance, who we were told was going to be part of that line of kings. Malcolm, about whom we know very little, and what we know is sketchy, So it's not clear that the play concludes by escaping the cycle of violence. It's not an accident that occasionally in productions like in the Polanski film, the last thing you see is Malcolm going to see the witches. Because we're kind of still trapped in that cycle of violence that somebody else is going to have to break out of. It's powerful stuff. The other thing, of course, is that it might not always, if you're reading this for the first time, it might feel like it's long and difficult, but it's actually not. It happens, it's a short play. It's the shortest of the major tragedies, and the story really moves quickly. A lot of the major plot points occur very, very fast, So, yeah, I think that this is what makes the story great. And I think it's the core of why we're continuing to read it and stage it and study it. Yeah, great story. Great story. That's it. There is, of course, a tremendous amount more to say. And we could, easily spend an hour just unpacking a single speech. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to deliberately try to keep these short. So I will leave it at that. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe. And if you enjoyed this, maybe you could make a suggestion or comment as to other kinds of things that you'd like to see me approach, whether that's Shakespeare or other stuff. Okay. All right. Till next time. Bye.